In the late afternoon of July 25th, 2000, aviation journalist Michel Polico was in his car, driving to his mechanics. His phone rang. It was one of his colleagues from the news organization France Info.
And a journalist of France Info told me a Concorde crash near Charles de Gaulle at 4:45 p.m. I answer, bizarre, there is no scheduled flights from Paris for Concorde at this time. So he told me, I call you back. During this time, I called a friend, pilot of Concorde, called Jean-Marco. He was a very good friend. And I called Jean-Marco, and he didn't answer, and I left a message on his voicemail. Jean, je t'appelle parce que France Info vient de me dire qu'un avion, un Concorde, se serait accidenté. And so I asked him to call me back.
5 minutes later, Michel's phone rang again. But it wasn't Jean-Marco. It was Michel's colleague from France Info.
And told me there is really a crash of Concorde. We have the confirmation of the authorities. And it was a flight taking off from Paris to New York and full of passengers. And it crashed on an hotel just after takeoff.
And Michel found out that the crashed Concorde had been piloted by his friend, First Officer Jean-Marco.
And so I left a message on the voice box of a man who just died. And day after day, I understood the reality of the accident. And I was very, pained.
As Michel headed to a television studio for a day of emotionally difficult interviews, word of the crash spread around the world. Air France Flight 4590 was carrying 100 passengers, a special charter flight of tourists, mostly from the same small town in Germany. Just 2 minutes after takeoff from Charles de Gaulle Airport, the plane crashed into a hotel in Gonesse, 5 miles to the west. All the passengers, the 9 crew, and 4 people on the ground died, while 6 others were seriously injured. And no one knew why Concorde had gone down in flames. On this episode of Making an Impossible Airplane, the untold story of Concorde, we will try our best to tell the story of the crash and its aftermath in a way that is truthful and respectful. It's an unimaginable tragedy for those who lost loved ones. It's also a dark moment in the lives of the teams who dedicated themselves to keeping Concorde flying safely. Teams that, as we'll hear, were asked to figure out what went wrong. This is Teamistry, an original podcast from Atlassian, makers of collaborative software including Jira, Trello, and Confluence.
I was at work, and probably shouldn't have been, but I was looking on the internet.
Concorde magazine editor Katie John.
And somebody said Concorde's crashed. And I looked on the news websites, and just the shock was awful. And then coming home and seeing the crash afterwards was just horrific. You never thought it could happen to Concorde.
Concorde historian Jonathan Glancy also has vivid memories of that day in July 2000.
Horrific moment in Concorde's history and in those people's lives. And for me, I just felt this is the end of it. That's the end of a whole era and everything that meant, of the excitement of this adventure into aerospace. And we just felt this is the end for Concorde.
That idea that this was the end for Concorde turned out not to be true. But this is one of the most pervasive misunderstandings of the Concorde story. The crash wasn't the end. Some would argue it wasn't even a major factor in the eventual end of Concorde. For now, we're going to find out what really happened on that day in July 2000. And as always, we'll stay focused on the teams of people who dedicated most of their careers to this airplane. Here's what former chief design engineer Ted Talbot wrote about the crash.
The feelings of those who designed and built this beautiful aircraft in the knowledge that something they had lovingly created had, by a combination of circumstances, resulted in the deaths of over 100 people. These feelings cannot be described. It was as though we were part of the families who had suffered this great loss, and to whom our sincerest sympathies are extended.
News outlets at the time reported that the engine had caught fire on takeoff, but no one knew for sure. In fact, people wondered if it might have been a bomb. The French Civil Aviation Authority immediately grounded Concorde, but British Airways kept their fleet in the air well into August. Aircraft maintenance supervisor Ricky Bastin.
I think it was something like August the 15th, 2000. We were departing the morning service to New York, and the aircraft pushes back, and we're just waiting for the airplane to go. It comes over the radio that the aircraft is ordered to return to stand because the Civil Aviation Authority in the UK have grounded the airplane. And that was the end of Concorde operations for now.
Concorde couldn't return to the skies until the reasons for the crash were understood. That task partially fell on the shoulders of the people who'd been working to keep Concorde flying. You've already met two of the leaders of that team, Chief Engineers Mike Hall and John Britton. John told me and my producer Pedro that he was vacationing with his family when someone from head office called.
So I left the wife and the kids in the caravan. I said, I'm off. I jumped in the car and I drove straight back to Filton.
John had been contacted and I had been contacted as well. And we were in the boss's office seeing about what we could do to send a team over there immediately to the crash site.
And that was absolutely horrendous because all our training, our apprenticeship, all those years' experience was aimed at keeping aircraft in a good airworthy condition.
So it was a terrible impact on the team who'd been working so closely on the aircraft. So it was an emotionally a very difficult thing. But that just got even more emotional as time went on for the next month, because I think we spent a month, or at least certainly I did, a month or almost 6 weeks in Gonesse at the crash scene.
And when did you head out there?
Immediately. I think that afternoon they said, go get some clothes, and we headed over there in an aircraft that the company chartered, and John and I went over straight away.
That actually, it makes me think that you went from basically the day before, you were aviation engineers, and now you're investigators.
Investigators. We're assisting the formal investigators to look at the details of the aircraft because we have the specific knowledge of the airplane, airframe systems, the flying operations and procedures that the accident investigators themselves may not personally have.
And can you walk me through what you saw when you first went to the crash site?
It's just a mass. There's a bit of the aircraft broke off, the nose broke off, and that was separated, and that didn't burn, but the rest of it was just burnt.
I recall very much the area was still smoldering and still on fire.
We had special kit, boots, overalls, and gloves, and hats, and masks, and things. And when we got back to our hotel, like Mike said earlier, we were out on the crash site for 6 weeks. And every night when you got back to your hotel, you took all your crash stuff off at the site, and when you got back to your hotel, first thing you did was add a shower. And I don't know whether it's psychological, but that smell in your nose, you could still smell it, and I can still smell it now. If I think about that, I can still. My brain can remember that. It was terrible. Yeah. It was absolutely terrible.
Wanted to look at the process of piecing together what had happened. So, Mike, you've described that process as extreme teamwork. Do you have any examples of that?
It was. One of the first things that we had, fortunately, was the French officials had the withstanding to go out and photograph the runway, and that was the first thing. They closed the airport that afternoon completely, and they took a helicopter and they flew up and down the runway several times and took photographs, and which was very important for the debris trail and for the soot trail on the runway, which gave us quite a bit of clues. They also sent out teams and they began to pick up debris, all kinds of debris. They didn't know what it was. They just picked up everything.
And we found this piece of metal, and we found a piece of tire on the runway next to that piece of metal. And as you can see, it's got that same shape as that bit of metal.
John is showing me 2 photos. In one, I can see what looks like a metal rule or ruler, like you'd use in school, but it's bent and twisted into a sort of capital L shape. It was later confirmed that this had fallen off another airplane before Flight 4590 took off. The other photo is of a section of rubber tire, and in the middle it looks like it's been sliced, in the shape of a capital L. As Mike says, this was part of a huge amount of debris from the runway and crash site, all of which could provide vital clues.
And we started looking at it with several teams. Some of the other individuals from the structures in the various areas from Aerospatiale and BAE came over to Toulouse and began to assist us in looking at the debris to see if there was any indications of something in the debris. And coupled with that data and the photographs that we had, particularly from this Japanese businessman who was on the flight, we began to focus quite a bit.
Just to be clear, this photo was taken not from Flight 4590, but from another plane on the runway at the time. Also on that plane, French President Jacques Chirac. In fact, as Flight 4590 struggled to take off, this other plane could have been hit if not for the Concorde pilot's attempt to take off. Can you describe the photo and what we can see in it?
Yes, you see the classic signs of Concorde in, if you will, a takeoff mode at high angle of attack. The nose is relatively well up. You see the landing gear extended, but you also see quite a lot of flame coming out from the port, just under the port engines, which is the inboard engine, just into the landing gear bay, and a rather extensive amount of fire, indicating that there was a significant fuel leak, at the very least, on the aircraft.
That famous photo, which you might have seen, is truly horrible. Concorde looking so elegant as it's taking off, but trailing this long stream of flame behind it. So it was clear to John and Mike and others that a fuel leak was the cause of the fire, not the engines. But what had caused the fuel leak, and what had sparked it into flame?
And on the site, we could identify bits of the aircraft that the authorities wouldn't recognize.
They had found this panel about the size of a sheet of A4 paper in the runway debris, and that began to open up many, many aspects of the actual event, this particular piece here.
Mike is showing me a picture of a 30 by 30 centimeter panel of torn black material, and it's got the ribbing from the inside of the fuel tanks. It's clearly a small piece of Concorde's wing.
But we couldn't understand why it appeared to have been blown out and not hit in.
And of course, we then begin to look into the mechanics of why do we have this piece on the runway laying there? Why isn't it an impact hole punched up into the aircraft and therefore lost to the investigation? And there was a whole big scientific investigation about hydrodynamic effects of impacting fuel tanks with high-speed objects and so on, pieces of tire debris.
They were starting to theorize what may have happened. The tire hitting the piece of metal, a piece of tire hitting the wing, which was also a fuel tank. But John explains the frustration they constantly encountered when trying to sift through evidence. That's because at the time, the crash zone was considered a crime scene, so it was controlled by the French police, known as the gendarmerie.
I don't know whether you know the French system, but as soon as you have any type of accident or incident that could result in a court case, the French judiciary appoint a judge, right? and the judge takes charge of the crime scene. And what they did, they brought in loads of gendarmes, and they were all over the site. When we found anything of interest, we look at it and we say, oh, yeah. And then the gendarmes would go, qu'est-ce que c'est, what is it, you know? And we say, oh, this so-and-so. And they would grab it, they'd have plastic bags, right? Like, for instance, the panel that blew out on the runway and those sort of bits, they'd put it in a plastic bag, and they seal it up, and the judge had a hanger at Le Bourget where he was putting anything that could be evidence, right? So instead of the crash investigators being able to look at things and investigate them, they were locked in the judge's hanger, and all we could do is go and look at it through a plastic bag. And then after a while, you know, the inside of the plastic bag, it gets scratched and whatever, you couldn't see anything. Yeah. And some of the bits would sit in there, like that panel was sat in there for weeks and weeks, and we weren't allowed. We wanted to get it analysed to see what the fracture surfaces were, whether it had been blown in or blown out or whatever, and we weren't allowed to. So it really hampered the speed of the investigation.
Yeah.
So it's very frustrating for us. So after a while, what we did, somebody, you know, we'd spot something and we'd say, here, that looks interesting there, Mike, or whatever. And yeah, okay, right. So then somebody would say, oh, look at this over here. And then the gendarmes would go over there, and then we say, okay, right, get that bit of evidence, take some pictures of it, you know,
before it would end up in a bag.
Yeah, we had to divert the gendarmes away while we did a bit of investigation.
Yeah. I've mentioned this before, John's ability to be lighthearted about even really heavy stuff. Again, that's probably just how we Brits deal with traumatic things. My producer Pedro, though, he wears his heart on his sleeve. He spent a lot of this interview on the verge of tears.
I'm thinking about the impact on you individually, your team members. I mean, in a way, I can almost imagine that at least you have something you can do, you can contribute. You're there, you're trying to, you know what, if you just sort of sat back here being like powerless, you're there doing it, but still.
This is like Poirot, right? Agatha Christie, the detective story, right? That's what we were doing. We weren't doing our normal job of keeping the aircraft safe and airworthy. We were part of an investigating team doing detective work. And all the time, for instance, that information that you read in there from the flight deck recorder and from the crash recorder, this information was being downloaded and fed back. And like Mike says, we were having meetings where you exchange, every day you have meetings with the authorities and they say, well, we've got this information which has come available, and we were looking at it. And then you had people back at base doing things, and we were feeding stuff back in, and they're saying, oh, well, how could those fuel tanks have been full up? And, oh, well, we found on the flight deck that the transfer switches were pumping fuel back. So it is a condition that could have occurred, which was previously unknown.
The entire tragedy, from when Flight 4590 began moving down the runway until it crashed, lasted just 126 seconds. The first 40 seconds were relatively uneventful, with the plane throttling up the engines and nearing takeoff speed. And then a tire hit a piece of metal on the runway. Pedro and I are at Aerospace Bristol with John Britton, and we're in the main hall with British Airways Concorde BOAF. John's going to tell us the story of what they were able to piece together from their weeks of investigation. But before he does, here's a bit of Concorde anatomy. Concorde has a total of 4 engines, 2 under each wing. Engines 1 and 2 under the left wing, and engines 3 and 4 under the right. Each pair is inside the rectangular power plant casing. Up against the power plants are the landing gear, a set of 4 tires under each wing. And remember what we learnt in an earlier episode, that pretty much the entire underside of each wing is covered in fuel tanks, right next to the power plants and the landing gear. Could you describe the damage? that plane suffered before the crash?
Okay, well, if we walk over to the main landing gear under...
So we're looking
it's the left landing gear. It was the number 2 on the forward one.
So it was the front right?
Yes.
Front right tyre?
Yeah.
On the left landing gear?
Yes.
Okay.
Right, so when the aircraft ran over this hot metal strip, and it was this sharp piece of, I think it was titanium, it's about the size of a 12-inch steel rule, and it was cranked. So it was stood up on the runway, and this tyre went over it, and it cut through, and that caused the tyre to burst.
So what happened after the tire burst, after it cut?
Right. So a piece of tyre came off, and it flew up. Now, bearing in mind that the wheel's going round, the aircraft is going along at 200 odd miles an hour, so the wheel is rotating rapidly, and it flew off, and it hit the bottom wing skin. Now, the next problem is that, I mean, none of these accidents are caused by one thing. They're always a series of things which add up on the day. Yeah. And over to here, there's the refueling panel.
It's a large rectangular panel labelled Refueling Access. There's something else you need to know about this situation. At Charles de Gaulle Airport, there's quite a long way for the plane to taxi from the gate until takeoff, and that requires more fuel.
Right. And what crews are allowed to do, the flight engineer, if he's got a long taxi out from the stand to the takeoff point, he can override the high-level cutoff and put extra fuel into the tanks. And on this day, that's what the crew decided to do. So his wing tanks were absolutely full, right? No airspace. Normally there's an air gap in the top, right? So when that great chunk of tyre hit the wing skin, the shock wave went through the fuel. It caused the fuel inside the tank to pressurize because it had no expansion capability.
In other words, because there wasn't an air pocket inside the fuel tank when it was struck, the force had nowhere to go but out.
And what that did, it caused the weakest part of the tank to fail. And that is what blew out the 30 by 30 centimetre square. And the fuel streamed out 60 litres per second coming out of that big hole. And we also think a bit of the tyre hit some of the electrics and maybe caused electric cable failure, which caused a spark, and that's what ignited and caused the fire.
Oh my God.
The pilots had so many crises to deal with at once. Engine 1 wasn't working, probably damaged by the debris. Engine 2 had been shut off because they thought it was on fire. So that means they don't have enough power to lift off properly. And then trying to avoid another airplane, the one the French president was on, and also trying to avoid populated areas near the airport. The crash was inevitable.
Devastated. We felt bad for the airplane, bad for Air France. Obviously, mortified to think all these bereaved folks, 113 people died in that crash. And, these are families torn apart.
That's Ricky Baston again, who at the time of the crash looked after maintenance for the British Airways Concorde fleet. So you can imagine the emotional impact it had on team members.
Because our training, our life in the aerospace industry, our whole training is about keeping the aircraft in a really good airworthy condition. That is our whole focus. Now, this is a situation that we were not trained for. We were thrown in and we were not used to this situation at all. And it had a a great impact on my health. And, bearing in mind that we were out on the crash site for 6 weeks, and then we were working on the modifications to get approval, sort out what modifications we needed to put in, negotiating it with the authorities, doing the tests.
As physically difficult and emotionally painful as it was to piece together what caused the crash of Flight 4590, I think there was one small comfort for the Concorde teams. The crash was the result of a myriad of decisions and conditions, not one single fault. Now that the teams looking after the Concorde fleets knew the details of the crash, work could begin on modifications. The French focused on installing Kevlar liners in the fuel tanks to offer more protection against punctures. We mentioned in the last episode that the relationship between the French and British teams didn't have the same geniality that had existed back in the 60s and 70s. Well, unfortunately, when there's a crisis, there's a tendency to lay blame. And so, instead of staying connected, where there were split responsibilities, like it used to be, there was now serious conflict.
The French were responsible for the wing design, and the part that failed was the wing structure. Okay, it was hit by a piece of tire, and immediately they said, we're going to put Kevlar liners in. And they launched in their design office a massive design program to make these liners to go all over the bottom of the wing. And then later on, we did a test specimen where we did a failure equivalent to what had failed in the actual Concorde crash. And we found that the leak rate, even with the liners in place, was much higher than could be accepted. And I had to go back to the French and say, I'm afraid your liners don't work. And there was a massive row where their lawyers accused me of not wanting to get the aircraft back into service. I went to my director and handed in my resignation. He refused. He went to the director in Toulouse, and they went down through.
But how did that, in terms of like you guys are working together, what was that like?
It was not good.
Yeah.
Their chief engineer came back and said, "Oh no, we didn't mean that. No, the lawyers got the wrong end of the stick. We didn't really say that. There was a massive row, and we had to go and do something different."
So, just to be clear, even though John's team wasn't convinced by the Kevlar liners, they did reduce the leak rate from 60 litres a second to half a litre a second. So they were adopted. Meanwhile, the Brits focused on reinforcing the landing gear. But the wheels remained a concern, as Ricky Baston explains.
The original tyres from Concorde, they were fairly early tyre technology. Because of the takeoff speed and weight, they were very high pressure. They were high pressure tyres, and they went through a lot of stress. And we did get problems with tyres blowing. It was a fact of life.
But just when it was needed, a solution arrived, thanks to the teams working in France.
The Michelin NZG tyre.
That stands for near zero growth. These tyres, which Airbus had been developing with Michelin for their airliner, the A380, were first introduced on Concorde. Zero growth because they don't expand as much as regular tyre rubber when inflated, so that if punctured, they won't burst. They were also constructed of a new reinforced material that could handle much heavier loads.
And that became the solution that got the aircraft back into service.
As much as the tyres were a breakthrough, returning to service wasn't a quick or simple process. Concorde aircraft, from both British Airways and Air France, had to be fitted with fuel tank liners, new tyres and reinforced landing gear cables. So the Concorde teams who'd kept the plane in the air for decades now had to face a new challenge, conducting grueling tests to assess these modifications, all to restore Concorde's airworthiness certification.
So all this testing, everything was going on. It was very stressful. We were having meetings, high-level meetings where there are political decisions being taken, a lot of pressure from British Airways to get the aircraft back into service. And one day I felt really ill, and I phoned my boss. I said to Robin, I said, I really feel ill. I said, I can't come in today. He said, well, go to the doctor. And I went to the doctor, and my blood pressure was 200/100.
Wow. Wow.
So,
blood pressure levels like that can lead to strokes, heart attacks, or other life-threatening health problems.
They put me on strong beta blockers and things and signed me off. So I couldn't go into the office for some time. So the team were carrying on. So it took a toll, I'm sure, not only on me, but a lot of the people that were involved with this accident and the repercussions and the return to service.
The teams that worked on Concorde had been through a lot, some of them all the way back to the prototypes of the 1970s, but nothing compared to this stress and anxiety. And yet, the desire to see Concorde return to the skies propelled them forward. Then, in late summer of 2001, it was finally time for proper test flights. The first, with no passengers, had been a success. But what Ricky Bastin really remembers was the dress rehearsal for returning to service, the first fully loaded Concorde to fly after the plane had been grounded in 2000.
Oh boy, I'll never forget that. It was something we'd been looking forward to, because I'd done the first test flight after the Paris crash, and that was an absolute breeze. But this one was special because there were 100 passengers, but every passenger was either a Concorde pilot or an engineer. We had full cabin service, including champagne. They didn't give us the good vintage stuff, but to keep it authentic, we still had champagne. There were bags loaded, just so the baggage teams could get back into the routine of loading Concorde. We flew out halfway to New York and then gradually turned back to Heathrow. And I'd wander up to the flight deck many times during the flight to have a chat with the guys. And it was a feeling of total elation. And the airplane behaved perfectly. There was nothing wrong with her at all. And we, do our approach into Heathrow. As we landed, everybody cheered. Everybody cheered as we landed. We taxied back to the gate and everyone's getting off the airplane, high-fiving everyone. And I'm stood by the passenger door. I was one of the last to get off. And I was talking to Mike Bannister, who was the captain of the airplane, and I had my cell phone in my top pocket. And I picked the cell phone up, and it's my youngest son, Daniel. I said, "Hi, Daniel, we just landed. It's fantastic. You have no idea." He said, "Dad, shut up, listen. An airplane's hit one of the twin towers, and we just heard the other tower's been hit with an airplane as well. And there's absolute devastation in New York." And my jaw drops.
That's right. Concorde's first fully loaded test flight was on the morning of September 11th, 2001. Katie John.
The shock of 9/11, in which the aviation industry as a whole took a massive hit. I mean, I think some airlines actually went out of business, and even airlines like British Airways thought they were looking down, a black hole, that they thought they themselves were going to be going out of business within the year. And then when 9/11 happened, about 40 of the people who died in the Twin Towers were actually regular customers of Concorde.
The impact of 9/11 was far-ranging, of course, but I never knew until now that it intersected with Concorde's history. Firstly, the attack happened exactly as Concorde was attempting to return to service. But more than that, just as Concorde's teams needed to restore people's faith in its safety, people around the world became wary of air travel for fear of terrorism. And then there's the direct effect on Concorde and the actual regular customers killed, as Katie said, which is significant because about 80% of passengers were repeat flyers. Remember, Concorde really only had two profitable routes between New York and London or New York and Paris. With all their financial eggs in this one basket, the future was precarious, But at least for now, there was a future for Concorde. Many people still believe that the crash in Gonesse is what ended Concorde, probably because that news was so much more dramatic and well covered than the return to service. But on November 7th, 2001, regular flights were restored between Europe and New York. What many people don't know is that 9/11 was a much more significant factor in Concorde's demise. Business travel simply did not return to its previous numbers. And all the while, Concorde's operating costs just kept skyrocketing. Ricky Baston.
There's no point pretending the engineering costs weren't high. They were. She needed probably 3 times the amount of manpower.
The finances of Concorde threatened its existence once again, despite the triumphant return to the skies, and despite the work of teams behind the scenes confident that the big white bird could keep flying.
We were looking at modifications to be done to extend the life of the aircraft even further, and then further than that. She could have kept going for a long time. Certainly another 10 years. Certainly another 10 years.
Next time, Concorde is grounded for good. We hear about its lasting legacy on the airline industry and in people's lives. And we find out if supersonic passenger travel might soon return to our skies.
I think I sat about here on the last flight of the aeroplane.
I was one of those lucky people who got to hear the very last shutdown on the Olympus 593 engine.
It was an absolute bombshell when this announcement was made.
It was just the emotion sinking in, very quietly, that this was the end of something that, from a child, you had absolutely adored, and now it was gone.
Ever since Concorde retired, we've been hearing, the next generation is only 5 years away, 5 years away, 5 years away.
That's next time on the final episode of Making an Impossible Airplane, The Untold Story of Concorde, on Teamistry, an original podcast from Atlassian.